Hello everyone, I welcome you to another video by Legacy IAS where we are going to talk about India and Australia, the constitutional comparison, where we are going to understand what are the areas of convergences, what are the similarities in the constitutional systems of India and Australia, and also look at the differences which are there in the foundational principles of the two countries. This is also going to help us understand the growing friendship of the 21st century between the two countries, especially when we look at the Indian Ocean region, the Indo-Pacific region, and also international groupings like the Quadrilateral Alliance. So in this regard, I hope you find this discussion extremely beneficial. Now, if we look at the Indian constitution and the features, the provisions of the constitution which have been borrowed or influenced by the Australian constitution, then we see that India actually borrowed the concept of a concurrent list from Australia. Now, India is of course known, the Indian constitution is known for the seventh schedule, whereby we have a proper distinction among the subjects among India and the states, among the center and the states. So between these two units of federation, we have the union list and the state list, but there's also a concurrent list. In India, we have a unitary bias whereby the ultimately the center is the one whose law kind of stays, but concurrent list is the one where we see, or hopefully at least it was made with the idea of more of a cooperative federalism between the center and the state. That concept have actually been picked up from Australia. Besides concurrent list, we also have the concept of freedom of trade that is being influenced from the Australian constitution, whereby we are trying to promote free trade, commerce, and intercourse and enterprise. All right. So that is also something that we've taken up from the Australian constitution. The whole concept of joint sitting between the two houses of the parliament, in the case of ordinary bill, as far as India is concerned, is also something which is being taken from the Australian constitution. We have the concept whereby on an ordinary bill, when there is not consensus that is coming in, or the couple of situations which arise 6 months, or there is disagreement, all right, or there is rejection, the situations in which we have the provision of joint sitting, that concept is being picked up from the Australian constitution. If we move towards an understanding that from these two constitutions, what are the common areas of convergences? Are there some similarities constitutionally between the two countries? We see that both the countries, both India and Australia, have a written constitution. Now, for India, it works out, of course, very well because we have a federation, and a federation whereby we're trying to keep our states together. So written constitution really helps us in this direction. Both the countries have a parliamentary democracy. Now, if we look at both India and Australia, they are heavily influenced by Great Britain, and they're heavily influenced by the systems that are there in Great Britain. And we've borrowed parliamentary democracy. India has borrowed parliamentary democracy from UK, and this system is also there in Australia. So there is again a very fundamental way in which our form of government, a very basic structure, is organized, the way in which executive and legislative are. All right, the liberal democratic tradition, fundamental values which are there between India and Australia are actually quite similar. Both believe in liberal democratic principles, provide that power to the public, have a kind of a free system of thought expression, speech. All right, there is a lot of support and encouragement of towards religious tolerance, that how you are trying to keep a very multi-diverse country in terms of religion. There is also encouragement with respect to freedom of speech as well as association, as long as of course it falls within reasonable restrictions. We have both the countries have a Westminster system of government. I was telling you how we are heavily influenced from Great Britain. Both the countries actually happen to be important members of the Commonwealth of Nations as well, and this is also an area of similarity between the countries. In terms of the way in which our legal system is being organized, the way in which we are not having any discrimination towards any individual or a particular section of the society is well reflected in their support towards, in their manifesting of the rule of law. All right, and the way in which judiciary kind of has a supremacy and looks over the executive actions and the legislative bills, the legal the bills and acts which basically the legislature is empowered to create. That is where the judicial review, the concept steps in, and there is a convergence between the two countries on the position of the judiciary in this regard. There is also a division of power between the head of the government and the head of the state. Like I was telling you, that in the Indian system also we have a head of the government who is of course the prime minister heading the council of ministers. All right, someone who enjoys the support in the lower house, and there's a head of the state. In Indian situation, it's the president who is the de jure head, but the real power lies with the prime minister, the head of the government in this case. If we look also towards the way in which our government is formed, okay, we are looking at the House of Representatives in the case of Australia. In India, it's the House of People, the Lok Sabha in the case of India, whereby that is being empowered to form the government, and actually the government is the one who is supposed to enjoy a majority in this particular house of the parliament. With the Senate, which is the upper house of Australia, is actually elected for a 6-year term. All right, and they are basically like a second chamber to look into any excesses, any wrong that can be possibly done by the Lok Sabha, by the lower house, to check any hasty legislations that might just come. These kind of checks and balances are also being performed by the Senate, elected for a similar 6-year term. We also have the executive power in the case of Australia being exercised by the Governor General. We don't have a Governor General in place, but a similar kind of a format is visible as is being reflected in a parliamentary form of government, and that is an area of convergence or similarity. In the Australian Parliament, we have the opposition whose task is to question the entire ethics of the government, entire rationale behind usage of money, usage of manpower by the government. So the government members are also supposed to kind of give their answers and try to validate and justify as to why certain policies are meant or designed in a certain way. There is also a very important focus towards the way in which we have, like I was telling you about rule of law. So the protection of this socially disadvantaged is also something that's very, very important. This is particularly visible in the case of the way in which aboriginals are, not discriminated on the grounds of race, skin, color, or even ethnicity. So these are some very, very important areas of similarity between the two constitutions. We also have a system in India of universal adult franchise. Similarly, in Australia, we have citizens over 18 years of age eligible to vote in the elections of both the central as well as the state governments. And in fact, it is so important to the extent that actually there is punishment in the event that there is a failure in executing this particular system. So they are treated very, very importantly in that country. If we look at the reorganization of states in Australia, we have the new states that can be formed basically by the assent of the parliament, and referendums also can be held by in this regard. All right, so in India also, when we have the formation of new states or bifurcation of new states, all right, any kind of such reorganization that has to be done, here also the parliament is the one, the legislature in the center, who is entrusted with that particular responsibility. We of course don't have the system of referendums in our country. We have to also look at the size and the kind of indirect democracy that we have in our country. But the concept of how parliament is the one who is entrusted with that responsibility is a point of similarity. The way in which appointment and removal of judges. So from apart from executive and legislature, we have similarity in the judicial system between India and Australia. And with regards to specifically the appointment and removal of judges is very similar to way in which it is there in India. So there are a lot of such areas where these two countries can fundamentally come together. There's a lot of starting ground that is being there, and it's well reflected in the way in which the two countries are growing with their friendship, are coming together in the 21st century. But having said or brought about all these rosy pictures between the two countries, there are some areas of differences in the way in which the constitutions is being organized. If you look at the way in which the Australian constitution or Australian independence has basically come up, it has come up in a very gradual way. It has evolved over the years. All right. If you look at the constitution as well, it was basically accepted by a lot of referendums, whereby there was direct involvement of the public in the framing of the constitution. This is very fundamentally different from India. India had a really violent, or for that matter, very sudden and haphazard kind of independence, in the sense that people were really fighting for their lives. There was a lot of loss of lives and property. That was not the way in which Australia got its independence. So it was much more peaceful in Australia, and hence people were also given so much of participation and involvement with regards to framing of the constitution. Whereas as far as India is concerned, only a select few who were a part of the Constituent Assembly were the ones who were entrusted with this responsibility. So we in India, even though we say that we the people of India have given to ourselves the constitution, essentially it is those people who had the privilege of being a part of that Constituent Assembly to actually write the constitution for the entire country. Also, in a very structural way, Australia is actually a constitutional monarchy. India, on the other hand, is a republic where the head of the state is elected. When we talk about a constitutional monarchy, we are not talking of election in any way. More so, we are talking of a much more hereditary form of the head of the state. All right. So there is a lot of allegiance that Australia gives to the Queen. All right. So in this way, the entire allegiance that Australia has towards Great Britain kind of continues and is very, very strong. So their connect with Great Britain is very different from ours. The Governor General is the one who basically represents the Queen, is the head of the state in Australia. So this head of the state, we still have much more of quote unquote a colonial hangover in Australia. The way in which the dependence is there, the way in which they're continuing the practices and their connects with Great Britain is massive in the case of Australia as compared to India. Also, if we look at Australia, we have citizens being referred to as British subjects. So it's not only the head of the state, but the way in which, till very recently, a lot of these citizens were actually referred to as British subjects, kind of gave an impression that what kind of sovereignty are you having? And they were in a way probably very happy also with their connect with Great Britain in certain ways. So India, on the other hand, is purely sovereign. We are people of India without having any allegiances, any sovereignty issues. All right. And only later basically they adopted their nationhood, but very recently, for a long time, they were actually referred to as British subjects, which is something that's extremely different from India. The Australian Constitution also doesn't come up with the concept of fundamental rights, the way in which there's an explicit mention and a part included in the Constitution, and that is so important for the Indian Constitution, that the fact that you can go to the court, go to the Supreme Court to get your fundamental rights restored is also a fundamental right. So that is a very stark difference that is being there between India and Australia, even though Australia also stands for protecting rights of people, but it is not as strong as the Indian system. The way in which secularism is actually practiced in Australia is also very different from the Indian system. In Australia, there's a very narrow interpretation of secularism, it's more like negative secularism, whereby you just kind of restricting the state from interfering. But in India, you have a more positive form as well, whereby all religions are kind of supported and encouraged, and you are free to practice, profess. All right, that is also an important fundamental right in India. If when we look at the nature of the government that is there, the federation which is there in India, as with comparison to Australia, the Indian form of federation is much similar to the Canadian form of federation, whereby there is much more unitary bias in that sense. But if you look at the Australian federation, it's actually very similar to the US federation, particularly where we look at the residuary powers being given to the states. So there is proper division of power between the center and the states in that respect. When in India, there is much more unitary bias in that respect. Moreover, the governors of the states are actually elected by the people and they are appointed by the British Queen. So the governors, as far as India is concerned, going by that unitary bias, are being appointed by the president. All right. So the president, of course, does it in on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. But the point is, it's been done by the executive at the center. It's very different from the one in Australia. Now, if you have to make an amendment to the Constitution of Australia, all right, you need a law that has to be passed by an absolute majority. All right. The majority requirement and the process of bringing in an amendment in Australia is much more difficult as compared to India. We have very different forms in terms of three types of majority that are basically needed in the event you want to bring any amendment based on the nature of amendment that you're trying to bring. So that is very different from Australia. If you look at the local government bodies there, they are created by legislature. All right. So legislation basically creates a local body, but in India, constitution itself has provided for a local body, all right, which is different for urban area and rural area. And that is again a point of difference between Indian and Australian government. So in that sense, we've gone through the kind of similarities and differences which are there, the influences which are there on the Indian constitution of the Australian constitution, and that's how we see in totality as to what kind of relationship can we have between the two countries. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion we had. Thank you so much.